this title that I've selected for today's talk is an impossible imperative. In simpler English, perhaps, that's to say that it's an instruction that's very hard to follow. This was a directive or a suggestion, perhaps, I made when I was appointed Artistic Director of Malta's National Centre for Creativity in 2014. And as the Artistic Director, I was charged primarily to create, to produce, more than to preserve what the organization was all about. In operating as more of a creative director than as an artistic director, I came to see how it's essential to consider all sorts of other things beyond production. And this comes partly, I would say, from my own background as what you could call a technical director. And in this way, it's because training in broadcasting, the earlier part of my career, and then with digital media, has made me someone for whom technology is seen as an enabler of all sorts of creativity. But in time, we've come to have a new term for this. And this is what I call myself now. I'm a digital curator. Or at least it's what I've been calling myself for the last 10 years or so. And in some ways, it feels like it's time to consider maybe changing this, but not so fast. And the reason for this is that we need to consider a little bit what is digital curation. Now, I have to be honest with you and say that in our one of our postgraduate courses that we teach here at the University of Salford, we spend a whole semester grappling precisely with this question. What is digital curation? And by the end of it, what we have to say to the students is, so what is digital curation again? So in this way, is to say that digital curation has many different facets and is used as a term to describe many different, even if related, types of practice. You'll see here there's very colorful embodiment, if you will, of one type of digital curation, which relates to the preservation of data. This was proposed originally about 15 years ago by the Digital Curation Centre at the University of Glasgow. Here's another one that I made about 5 or 6 years ago for a book we produced with Bloomsbury called Documenting Performance, in terms of the ways we can attempt to preserve performance. But neither one of these answers the question, what is digital curation? It just gives you a sense of what digital curation deals with. So, truthfully, this term digital curator, I am every day finding more and more problematic as a way to describe myself. I think it's easier if we forget the digital bit. I mean, after all, it's the same as with digital media. Can you remind me the last time any of you used any media that's not digital media? So digital media is media now, really. You know, that's the point. And in the same way, we're all curators. Yeah? We're all curators. Think of, even in your pocket right now, the hundreds of photos you have on your mobile device. This doesn't apply to everybody, perhaps, but it applies to a lot of us here in this room and a lot of us watching this. So you deleting or organizing or somehow tagging any of those photos is an act of curation. And that makes us 21st century curators, because curation perhaps is an idea and the concept that comes from art, particularly, at least going back to the 19th century historically. And it relates to a bunch of things. But primarily, curation is something that is associated with art, but that I would argue, if I were to say that now, everybody's a curator. That curation is something that we all do, but that we all do in different ways. So there are some related keywords to curation. It's selecting, just as in the example with the photos on your mobile device. Yeah? Organizing, caring, presenting, yeah? How you share these then through social media platforms or even just by emailing them or messaging them to someone you care for or someone who may be in that picture. In the same way, preservation, which is a significant aspect of the type of curation that I practice and that I'm proposing here, would have the same kind of keywords associated with it. Now, what's interesting, at least to me, and I hope also to you, is that when we move to production, the one keyword that is less relevant is caring. And so all of a sudden, care becomes a very central keyword to what I'm proposing here to you today. So, why care? And why care is how I came up with what I used to call my strategic vision for Malta's National Center for Creativity. And there, this idea of identity, diversity, and legacy was a way to address three key questions. Who are we? Who are we as individuals? Who are we collectively? How is this relevant in relating to each other especially? What makes us different from each other? What makes us similar to each other? And what did we do in the sense of what is it that we may leave behind us when we're gone? And this is legacy, of course. So in this way, if I were to turn this into a what question, so care for what, am I talking about archiving everything? Well, perhaps that's even more impossible than the original instruction I started with as the title of this talk. But the other point is, and I can't emphasize this enough, is whose stories are we telling? And I think here it's useful to consider that it's everyone's stories. So I mentioned briefly a history of curation, or what curation has been about historically, and it's been about power, really. It's been about a bunch of mostly male, middle class, mostly white, in many cases colonial men, telling the rest of the world what to care about. What's being proposed now, of course, is that each and every one of us has a relevant story to tell. And so everyone is whose stories we're caring for. So community voices and perspectives in this context are essential. But how do we care is a harder question. And here, in some ways, this becomes a little less clear, at least to me, I would expect also to you, into how we relate this strategic vision of identity, diversity, and legacy to these key actions of impossibility, including everyone, and looking at legacy as something that is essential. And I wouldn't say that identity is impossible, but it's very hard to pin down identity because identity is very, very fragmented in every way. So, relating it to the concept of rejuvenation, am I really proposing here that we consider rejuvenation through preservation? Well, perhaps I am, in the sense that I've subtitled this talk as a strategy for rejuvenation. And one of the things I like to do, I don't know about you, different people like different things, of course. I like to play with words. Some people like to play with games, others like to play with food. I don't know. I like to play with words. And so for me, rejuvenate relates to revitalize, re-energize, and significantly restore. Now, again, in playing with that, store again, storing again, and storing, isn't that archiving? And in archiving, aren't we also preserving? And so you can see why I like playing with words. So this would be the beginning then of a strategy for rejuvenation, rather than, a blueprint and just to say, here it is, this is what I'm proposing. This is an exploration that I'm sharing with you. And so what I'm attempting to do in the process is to connect rejuvenation with preservation through restoration. And restoration is indeed to rejuvenate. Think of the restoration of a historical building. How it's rejuvenated when the layers of pollution are taken off it, or when, some of the stonework is reworked and restored. Yeah, so there's an element of rejuvenation through preservation just there. But if what we're saying is to rejuvenate, to preserve, to restore, the one word we come back to is care. And you can see how, I hope you can see how I have led to this being the key word, or the central key word of what I'm proposing here to you today. There are, of course, pragmatic perspectives to this. I mean, I'm not an economist, I'm not a mathematician or anything like that, but we're talking about finite resource allocation here, whether it's time, whether it's money, or whether it's capacity, really, because that's what time and money relate to. Capacity is that the more you produce, the less you have the capacity to preserve. And the other way around, of course. The less you produce, the more time and money you can allocate instead to preservation. And so, care is what we're buying. Care is what we're making time for, and care is what we need the capacity to have. So if I were to bring this to a conclusion in a way that kind of pulls everything together, I would say that instead of stop producing, start preserving, we could simply say stop consuming, start caring. Thank you very much.